Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Director, Institute of Chinese Studies, I welcome you to today's Wednesday seminar. We have with us Sri Vijay Gokhale, who will be speaking on the topic Tiananmen Square, the making of a protest. This talk will be centered on the international environment and the domestic and political environment in China in the 1980s and how the events of 1989 are relevant in understanding China even today. We have Sri Vijay Gokhale joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1981 and was India's High Commissioner to Malaysia and later India's ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany and the People's Republic of China. He served as Foreign Secretary of India from January 2018 to January 2020 and is currently Distinguished Professor at the Symbiosis International University, Pune, non-resident Senior Fellow at Carnegie, India, and Emeritus Resource Faculty at the Rashtriya Raksha University, Gujarat. The chair, Sri Shyam Saran, needs no introduction. A former Foreign Secretary, he served as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy on Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change and was the chairman of the National Security Advisory Board from 2013 to 2015. He is currently a trustee and a member of the board of several institutions, including the World Wildlife Fund India, the Institute of Chinese Studies Delhi, and the Federation of the Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. We also have the print as our media partner today. Before we begin, I would like to remind the participants about a few ground rules. All participants except the speaker and the chair will remain muted. Participants are requested to send their questions using the chat box or using the raise hand option. You are requested to remain muted unless called upon to do so by the chair. I now invite Sri Shyam Saran to begin today's proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, and I would like to express my gratitude to the Institute for Chinese Studies for organizing this conversation. I have already, reviewed, in fact, Vijay's book, Tiananmen Square, and that itself testifies to the fact that I found the book extremely engaging. But much more than that, really looking at the deeper implications of this very important event in Chinese history. I particularly liked this book because this is perhaps one of the first books which is a kind of an eyewitness account of a very important and historic event. And I think as far as India is concerned, we have very few of these genre of literature in international affairs. So I would hope that what pioneering role Vijay's book has played in actually inaugurating this kind of reporting, this will be not only followed by other scholars, but I would hope that Vijay, who has been a eyewitness to many historic events, not just in India-China relations, but as even as foreign secretary and as envoy to many countries, that he will give us the benefit of his perspective on many of these events. So, if I have a complaint to make about the book Tiananmen, I would have liked to see much more, for example, what Vijay's own role was, in a sense. It is too much of a witness, less as a participant, because he was also a participant in these very important events. So Vijay, just very friendly criticism on that particular account. And, the reason why I raise this is because Tiananmen in 1989 was actually Tiananmen 2.0. There was a Tiananmen 1.0, which, people like Shankar Menon and I had, the opportunity to witness. And that was also similar circumstances because it was in April. It was, the Qingming festival. Zhou Enlai had died just a few months before in January. And when the festival came, we started off with just a few wreaths in Tiananmen Square, and before we knew it, I mean, just like in 1989, the entire huge square was a forest of floral wreaths, and pastings all over the place. Criticizing the Gang of Four, and eulogies to Zhou Enlai as the people's premier. That was also historically a very, very important, and also put down, by the way, with the same ruthlessness which we saw in 1989. And Shankar Menon and I spent a lot of time moving around these huge crowds in Tiananmen Square and getting a sense of what the sentiment amongst the demonstrators was, going and reading some of the postings. There were poems, there were almost literary pieces on China's history and culture. It was quite a dramatic event. And so this, of course, in 1989, it was on a much larger scale than it was in 1976. So I can imagine, I have some visual image of, what it must have been like, and what a exciting event it must have been for somebody like Vijay. So this is a great book, and I would hope many more people will buy it and read it, because it is really a delight to read. It also the writing style is very good, because it is a very readable book. It is something that the general reader, not just a scholar, but a general reader, would be able to relate to and appreciate. So I think that instead of my going on about the book and about the events, we are at a juncture in Chinese history where India-China relations are fraught. There is tension on the borders after a long interval. We are also seeing, my sense is that we are also seeing considerable churn within China itself in its politics. Even the speech made by Xi Jinping, on the 100th anniversary of the CPC, at least I found some clues as to, yes, there is confidence, but it appears that there is acute insecurity as well at that high level. So there is that internal tension which I think we should look out for. And in that sense, the events leading up to the Tiananmen incident in 1989, perhaps we can see maybe parallels today. So it would be very, I think it would be very worthwhile to hear Vijay, with his more contemporary experience of China. Does he see some of those elements, currently in China's domestic policy? So without any further ado, I will turn the platform to Vijay. Vijay, you have the floor. I would hope that you can speak for maybe about half an hour and a little more perhaps, and then we can take it from there. Thank you very much for your attention. Please, Ashwin.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for chairing today's event. And I also want to thank the Institute for Chinese Studies and its director, Mr. Ashok Kantha, for inviting me. So I have been writing this book in my mind for 30 years. So the question when I retired was whether it would still be relevant, because 30 years is a generation in terms of time. But I did feel that it was important to write the book, because the Communist Party of China still continues to be the ruling party and has only got more powerful and richer and much more influential. And therefore, it would not just be a subject of historical interest, but might also be a subject of contemporary relevance. When I decided to write the book, I took two decisions. One, that it would be written for the Indian reader. I wasn't writing for the international audience. I wanted to write it for ourselves, for the people of India. And secondly, as you pointed out yourself, sir, it was to be in a way which was not very academic, but more readable, and therefore anybody who is curious to know about China, not just the scholar, could read that book. There were a couple of other decisions that I had to take, and these were also decisions which I had to think over. The first was whether to simply recount what happened in those 50 odd days between the 15th of April and the 4th of June, to which I was an eyewitness, or whether I should situate the book in a larger context. And I felt that it was important to situate it in a larger context, because in a sense, the happenings at Tiananmen Square had their roots in a 10-year period after Deng assumed office or power as the leader of China. And it was to some extent the outcome of the policies he adopted, the people he appointed, and so on. So I therefore made the book more than just the 50 days of Tiananmen and expanded it to the decade of 1980s. The second decision was one that you referred to as to whether it should become a memoir, a first-person account, or a more an account where I placed the incident at some distance from myself. And I consciously decided I wouldn't make this a me thing, because I felt that otherwise it might just be simply dismissed as the views of one individual. And therefore I wrote the book putting some distance between myself and the book. And as a result of that, some of the anecdotal evidence that I personally witnessed, I did not put in the book, because I couldn't find any corroborating sources for it. For instance, there were visual images which me and my family saw from our balcony of the attack on the PLA formations by the crowds, of soldiers being pulled out of the armored personnel carriers and so on, of the manner in which the police dealt with the demonstrators. But since I really had no corroborating evidence, I did not include that in the book. Essentially, therefore, the book was one which eventually turned out to be a recounting of the incident that happened in 1989 in the larger context of the decade of the 1980s. Now, essentially, sir, there were three main strands that I wanted to deal with in the book. And so I tried to sort of weave them together. The first, of course, was Deng's story, the story of Deng Xiaoping, because these were the years when he performed the reform in opening up policy that has led China to the position it is in today. And anybody who reads the book will, I presume, reach the conclusion that, at least from my perspective, if there is any hero in the People's Republic of China in the 70 years that it has ruled China, at least for me, that is Deng Xiaoping. A person who had not only a vision, but the courage of conviction to discharge that vision, despite having political setbacks and even having to sacrifice his own appointees. So at one level, that was the story I wanted to tell. At the second level, the story was of inner party differences spilling out into the open and eventually bringing a certain amount of chaos to China. And I felt this was important because at least many of the Indian friends I have and people I have spoken to still have this persistent impression that China, or the Communist Party of China, is a monolith, that it is completely united, it is non-transparent, and that everybody marches to the same tune, and that Mao, Deng, and Xi are the absolute dictators who brook no opposition, and there is no dissent. And my intention was to actually hopefully convince readers that this is a party where there is dissent. It may not be visible all the time, but we cannot assume that because it presents a united front externally, that this is in fact the situation within the party. The third strand was interesting, sir, and this was essentially my own take on how the West saw Tiananmen. You served in China twice in difficult periods in the 70s and the 80s, and you know from personal experience, so does Mr. Ashok Kantha, that access to the Chinese is difficult, and that our sources were to a great extent dependent on the Western diplomats as well as the foreign media, particularly the Western media who had access and who covered events and who had the capability to visit many more places than we could as diplomats from the Indian embassy. So obviously, throughout this 60-day or 50-day period, I was interacting quite closely with them. And at least to me and to those who were serving in the Indian embassy in 1989, some of their analysis, a lot of their assumptions seemed, to say the least, not corroborated by fact or not sort of supported by evidence. And so I felt that from my perspective, we must look at whether the West got this right or wrong, and if they got it wrong, why they got it wrong. So essentially, these were the three strands that I brought into the book. On the first strand, which is regarding Deng Xiaoping, the main point I tried to bring out in the book is that this was a leader who was really going into completely unknown territory. Not only was he steering the world's largest, most populous nation away from Maoism with its class struggle and its mass line connotations towards opening up and reform, but he was doing this with a view to also with keeping in mind the need to maintain political stability so that the party did not topple in the process. And in hindsight, I wonder whether it went through his mind at the time, certainly in the late 1980s, that the mother party, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, was taking the opposite line. In other words, pushing glasnost or political reform over perestroika or economic reform, whereas Deng was talking of reform and opening up, but not of political liberalization. And surely it must have led to some doubt in Deng's mind as to whether his course of action was the right course of action or the Gorbachev line was the right line. But I give great credit to this leader that he had courage of conviction. He had a vision. He stuck to that vision. He made political sacrifices, both in terms of his own people as well as in terms of principle. And he showed a certain degree of both flexibility when it was needed and ruthlessness when it was demanded of him. And I would presume that eventually history probably proved that his line was the correct one, certainly in comparison to the line that the Soviet Union took. And 1989, as we both know, was a historic year because the year that China survived the revolutions, the color revolutions, the Soviet Union went down. The same year, the Berlin Wall fell, and so on. So at one level, the book essentially was Deng's journey in these 10 years and his putting China on the track to global power as such. The second part of the book was essentially how this inner party struggle developed. Of course, this has always been the case in the 50s with the Let 100 Flowers Bloom campaign, in the 60s with the events leading up to the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, and so on. And therefore, the 80s was no different. There was the pull and push between those who wanted to focus on the economy and on reform and those who wanted to focus on politics, on ideology, on keeping the Communist Party faithful to its doctrine and faithful to its cause. Now here, of course, that tension initially was relatively easy for Deng to handle, I felt, because everybody was exhausted with the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. It exhausted everybody, whether you were from the left, the right, or the center. And so they just preferred to go along with Deng Xiaoping, because the alternative, of course, was the Gang of Four, and the thinking of the Gang of Four, which I presume still persisted in sections of the party. But I also show how by the mid-1980s, opposition had begun to surface. And my own sense is that the opposition, of course, partly came because the reforms led to certain difficult situations for the public in terms of the job became less predictable, housing became difficult, food prices arose, and so on. But it also partly was because those who survived Mao's purges, the communist leaders who survived Mao's purges, felt entitled now to reap the rewards of the revolution for themselves and for their successors, their families, the generations to come, and perhaps felt that Deng's chosen successors were endangering that. So, in a sense, it was a struggle within the party, both at a personal level and at the ideological level that was occurring, because I feel that sometimes we seem to omit the fact that ultimately any political party is made up of people. People have strong views, and those views can fundamentally influence the way in which parties behave, not simply ideology, but also the personal likes, dislikes, and views of individuals. So I thought that this was an element I should bring in. And really for the curious Indian, the average Indian who didn't know much about China, at least I hope that I left them, her or him, with the impression that this is not a monolithic party, that this is a party which, like parties in any democratic state, have inner party struggles, a certain amount of inner party democracy as well, and a certain amount of infighting, although, of course, in this case, the infighting eventually spilled out into the open, which is a fairly rare event. The third element, of course, was the Western element. And here I am, as you correctly observed in your review in the Business Standard, quite critical of the way the West approached this. My own sense is that the West approached this in a very predetermined way. We do have to make allowance for the fact that in 1989, we were still in the midst of the Cold War. And nobody really knew that 6 months later, the entire edifice would come crashing down. So, of course, Western diplomats were not simply diplomatic analysts. They also thought ideologically. And so did the Soviet diplomats and the East Bloc diplomats. To that extent, I considered myself, and I think the Indian embassy considered itself, to be fortunate because, being quote unquote non-aligned, we were perhaps less ideological than either the Americans or the Soviets or the Russians, and therefore could look at things a bit more objectively. And I feel that helped. But notwithstanding that, the manner in which Western diplomats approached this whole issue, and the manner in which the Western media also approached it, gave me the sense that they were working in tandem, perhaps to some agenda. And that the stories that were being put out were one-sided. Now, there are 2 or 3 things which very strongly convinced me that this was not simply poor reporting or bad judgment, but something which had an agenda to it. First, of course, the manner in which they were urging and coaxing the students to to appear on Western television and in Western media to project their case. And I do recount the story of a very prominent American journalist taking one of the principal demonstrators, Wu Erkaixi, for dinner at a time when he was supposedly on a fast unto death in the square. And while that is a perfectly reasonable thing that all of us do as diplomats, we all are supposed to cultivate people through their stomach, but he never disclosed this fact. And nor did any other Western journalists, although, as we know, subsequently several of them knew about it. Another case I do want to relate is the famous picture of the Tank Man, which we all know is an iconic picture. Now, of course, the real photograph, if you look at the original photograph of the Tank Man, this is the Chinese man stopping tanks departing from Tiananmen Square, not entering it. Now, this does not in any way reduce the remarkable bravery of this young man, but it does lead to the question as to what he was stopping in that case, because the whole objective of the cropped image was to convince the world that the ordinary Chinese citizen had stood up to prevent the tanks entering into the square and hurting the students. Whereas in fact, the photograph was taken after the whole matter was dealt with and the tanks were exiting the square. And even today, if you go to the internet, the original grainy photo is still there of the tank exiting the square and the man standing in front of the tank column. Now, so I felt this was disingenuity on the part of the Western media, merely to use a photograph incorrectly to convince a public opinion of a certain way of looking at things, when in fact the photograph was not intended to be that way. Yet another instance, which subsequently has been supported by documents which have been declassified, was a statement which Australian Prime Minister Bob Hawke made on the 7th of June. In a press conference, he read out a telegram from the Australian Embassy in Beijing, in which he described how tanks had driven over the remains of the dead students in the square, that subsequently that the remains had been hosed down into a drain. Now, interestingly, even before the certain documents were declassified, the person who originated this telegram, the Australian councillor Richard Rigby, subsequently was my colleague when I returned to Beijing in 1997. And he told me at that time that actually in his telegram, he had qualified it with the words tentative and impressionistic and so on. But Prime Minister Bob Hawke never, he conveniently omitted those phrases, the phrases of conditionality. But what was even more surprising was subsequently the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office declassified records about Ambassador Alan Donald's telegram to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office on the same day. What was striking was the great similarity. In fact, you could call it identical. The telegram which issued from the British Embassy to London and from the Australian Embassy to Canberra were almost identical in their description. And the British ambassador used the word fact at least 8 times. He said it was a fact that tanks had run over students. He said it was a fact that the remains had been hosed into the drains, and so on. And he was sending this report to London on the basis of a single source who was not present in the square, who had reported to another source who was not present in the square either. Now, this was contrary to diplomatic practice. We in the Indian Embassy, under the guidance of Ambassador C.D. Ranganathan and Deputy Chief of Mission Shiv Shankar Menon, were told that we could not report anything unless there was corroborating evidence, or at least if more than one diplomat had physically or seen this. On the other hand, here you had the British ambassador reporting fiction without corroborating evidence. So I did come to the conclusion overall that the West misread the situation in the Tiananmen incident. They perhaps looked at it through ideologically tinted glasses, and that in some cases there perhaps was an agenda involved in this. Now, I'm not stretching the argument to assume, therefore, that this was a plot by the West to bring down the communist regime, because I did not find any indication of this. But what I am saying is that there was certainly an effort by sections of the diplomatic corps and the media to discredit the Communist Party, not entirely based on verified fact. And I think this is important for Indians to understand as well, because while free media is an essential part of our democracy, and indeed democracy can only survive with the free media, we should be careful in recognizing that we should not give prominence to Western media over our own. We do tend to think that perhaps the BBC or CNN or Le Figaro or some newspaper in Japan might be more objective than the Times of India or the Hindustan Times or Tarun Bharat or Navbharat Times. But I don't think that's the case. And that was one point I did want to sort of elliptically convey to the readers. Now, of course, the last point I want to make, sir, before we come to questions is, I did in the last chapter try to relate what happened in Beijing of 1989 to the China of today. Because first, because the Communist Party still rules China and therefore it is important. But secondly, because you and I know very well that this event shaped China's political future much more than probably any other event. And the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed within 6 months traumatized Chinese. I think it would be fair enough to say it traumatized the Chinese Communist Party. And it probably convinced them that, that the only way for China to avoid going down the Soviet path to collapse was to tighten ideological control, to tighten political control, and to re-emphasize the importance of ideology and socialism and so on, which might have got diluted. And therefore, the point I hope that readers take away is that while President Xi Jinping has adopted a different style of functioning, there's no doubt about that, the core message, whether it is Mao, Deng or Xi, is that if the supremacy of the Communist Party is challenged, the Chinese must come out with all guns blazing. I think that core message was probably as relevant in 1989 as it is today. And to that extent, Deng and Xi acted in quite a similar fashion. And if you see the post-1989 events, the re-emphasis on party history, which took place in 1989, the major rectification campaign that took place in the cadres in 1989, and the purges in the People's Liberation Army, which took place in 1989, because it is believed quite widely that at least some sections of the PLA were unhappy with the manner in which they were used. And look at what Xi Jinping is doing today. You see some kind of a similarity, that these were actions which arose because the party felt threatened. Threatened because, not threatened so much from the outside as from within, because it felt that it was weakening from within and it needed to shore up its defenses. So the point I do make is therefore that of course, Xi Jinping is not Deng Xiaoping simply because China is 10 times as strong and has 10 times as many implements available. But the core position, which is that the party's supremacy must be maintained at all cost and must never be conceded, that thread continues to run through the Communist Party, and to that extent, Deng was no different from Xi, and Mao was no different from Deng and Xi either. So broadly, so then I hope that at the end of this book, the person who has not sort of followed China, who doesn't, who unlike us or even people listening into this who are mostly people who do know China, I'm hoping that those people firstly feel that Chinese politics is not all strange names and heavy ideology. It's like Indian politics or American politics, and something which we all should take an interest in. And secondly, that we need to take an interest in it because it is a major neighbor, and for the first time in 70 years, we're encountering an entirely unforeseen situation, which is a superpower on our doorstep. A situation we have not encountered in the first 60 years of our independence. So this is a very new situation, and therefore I think we will, if we continue to ignore China, and by we I don't mean the government or even the academic community, but the average Indian, if we continue to ignore China, we do so at our peril. So those were the various ideas I tried to put forth in the book, and I sort of welcome whatever views that those who are listening in today have, and I'm ready to answer whatever questions they have. Thank you, and thank you once again for giving me this opportunity to talk to all of you.
Thank you very much, Vijay, and you have very cogently and lucidly, highlighted some of the key points that you have made in your book. And I think each one of those points are eminently, relevant to our debate about China. I will just make a few comments before opening this out to questions from the people who are participating. One is that you mentioned the very important role that Tang played in terms of the whole transformation of China, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. I have a slightly I'm not a difference from you, but I would like to make the point that it may not be entirely correct to say that Tang was not concerned about political reform. That actually he made several important political reforms, not, of course, in any way diluting the authority of the party. So on that point, I think you are right. Starting with Mao Zedong, coming to Xi Jinping, no leader has questioned the important centrality of the party and its authority, which must not in any way be diluted. So that's correct. But having said that, if you see, for example, the importance of some kind of a collective leadership, or some kind of a smoother transition, or at least an effort to make a smoother leadership transition, rather than the kind of very disruptive sort of transitions which took place in the past, even during his time. I think that was important. And some effort to separate the party from, not separate, but in a sense, redefine the role of the party, say, vis-a-vis the state, redefine the role of the party vis-a-vis the PLA, so a greater degree of professionalism in the armed forces, greater degree of professionalism in the bureaucracy, with the party exercising overall control, overall supervision. This was something that I think he did try to bring about. Secondly, one very important reform that he made, or I think something which is also very important, is the reform in terms of the management of the economy and the enterprises, and particularly, in fact, even giving space for private enterprise. Because there also, I think there was a view that there should be some autonomy given to enterprises to work according to some degree according to market forces. So the party, in a sense, stepped back a little in terms of handling this whole reform process. So I believe that one should not make the mistake of thinking that there were no political reforms at all. In fact, Tang was responsible for some very key political reforms, which to some extent are being, in a sense, questioned and even perhaps reversed in Xi Jinping's time. So that was the first point I wanted to make. The second is quite right. I mean, that, we have neglected the fact that there have always, in fact, been inner-party differences. In fact, in some way, it would be correct to say that the Chinese Communist Party is somehow habituated to factionalism and factional fighting. And you see each time that there has been a leadership transition or change, you also see, I believe that, the party works through patronage networks. So if there is a leader who's sort of going up the ladder, a lot of people who are associated in his orbit, they also go up with him. If he falls, then very soon, that whole patronage network is, at least an effort is made to approach it or to co-opt some of them by the new leadership. But this is something which is endemic, I believe, in the Chinese Communist Party. And the third point about the West, yes, again, true. But I think at that particular point of time, my sense was that there was a lot of wishful thinking in the West. because while there was very negative reporting once the sort of violence broke out, but before that there was almost a sense that, oh, this party is very comfortable with these demonstrations. They are not really very worried about this. There is a willingness to accept that there will have to be a democratic transition. These are young people. There is a festival-like atmosphere in the square. So, the party actually is very mature and is very, willing to sort of accept this kind of change. Our view, I don't know whether in the embassy in Beijing, but certainly I was watching this from Tokyo. And the Japanese diplomats whom we were talking to, they were giving this time that, there is really nothing to worry about. Again and again, this word would be used. Oh, this is like a festival. Everybody is very relaxed. Everybody is very happy. Nothing is going to happen. And I very much recall the occasion where Chao Ziyang was telling Gorbachev that, he was in fact looking at the audience, not looking at Gorbachev, and he was making out as if every decision is being taken by Deng Xiaoping, and much of what is happening is is really, in a sense, Deng is behind it. And I remember remarking to a very senior Japanese diplomat who was sitting next to me and watching this and saying, Chao Ziyang is going to go now. There is no way that he can stay, in power. And he said, no, there is no way. Everybody is very relaxed. We have, a lot of contact with the Chinese leadership. Our people are meeting them all the time. I can assure you that there is no such, sense of anxiety anywhere. No, the point that I'm making is that at a certain stage, before the violence broke out, there was this other narrative that everything is fine. This is, festival-like atmosphere. Maybe a democratic transition is something that China itself is willing to accept. And it changed very dramatically once, the situation changed and the party took the ruthless action that it did. So yes, I think it is very important that we should make up our own mind with regard to what we see happening. And I think, to be fair, much of the time this has been true of a lot of reporting on China from the Indian embassy itself. If you go back to the records, you will see that our view about many events has been quite different from the view that has been expressed by many other commentators. So on all these 3 points, I would agree. And I think I have reported somewhere, that you mentioned how traumatic an event, the changes in the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union was. And you see this reflected in what Xi Jinping has been saying, that some of the most important speeches he has made is, don't forget the lesson of the Soviet Communist Party, and that what keeps me awake at night is that a Chinese Gorbachev may appear. And this would be a disaster for China. So thank you very much, Vijay, for your, not only for writing this book, but also for giving us a very good sort of summary of some of the key points you have made. And lastly, I would say the importance of really educating ourselves about China, not the scholars, not the diplomats, but on a much wider scale. I think there is enormous ignorance about China in this country, and that can be very damaging in the future. So I fully endorse your recommendation in that respect. So let me now open the floor for any questions or comments. Please identify yourself. And Mr. Venkatraman, would you help me in terms of just identifying some of the people who are asking the questions? If you can please conduct the question and answer, that would be very helpful.
Ambassador Vishnu Prakash would like to ask a question, sir.
Okay. Vishnu? Vishnu, are you there? I think maybe he might have asked the question in the chat box.
No, he's just posted, I have a question and thanks.
I see. Okay, we'll go to the next question. We'll come back to him.
Okay, am I audible now?
Yes, you are audible now. Please go ahead, Vishnu.
Thank you, sir. Vijay, compliments. It's a great book. One has read it with a lot of interest. Just two bits, small bits. In the closing comments, you said something very interesting, that we should not be ignoring China. And then you said that it's not for the government, etc., but it's for the people of India. Would you like to elaborate on that? Secondly, you have made a very good point in that you mentioned that there was an agenda, Western agenda. There was a lot of speculation. There was a lot of falsehood being spread. And what was needed was first-hand accounts, which was authentic and realistic. What could have been more authentic and realistic? What you yourself saw here, and what you yourself saw, you did not share it with the people. I mean, if it was hearsay, I can understand corroboration. But here was somebody who knew what he was seeing. So why did you deprive us of those gems? Thank you.
Thank you, Vishnu. Vishnu, coming to your second question first. At the end, I was only a partial eyewitness because, for instance, there were days when we were not in the square. Certainly on the third night and the fourth morning, I was not in the square. Although there were some of the other colleagues from the embassy who were around that place, but I was not there. But more than that, Vishnu, I felt that if I write it as a first-person account, it will be dismissed as simply the views of one individual. And I didn't want that impression about the book. I wanted it to be more to be seen more as something for which we could all draw some kind of lesson or some kind of inspiration. As far as the second point is concerned, your first question, my sense is that within the government and even within the academic and strategic communities in India, there is a fairly good understanding of China. And among the younger people, including the Institute of Chinese Studies, but even outside, there is some good research being done. My concern is that we are so Western oriented, so interested in American politics and culture, European politics and culture. We travel to America, we travel to Europe, we're fascinated with that we failed to interest our own people in China. And to that extent, it has nothing to do with communism, because you have served in both China and Japan. And so has Ambassador Shamsaran. And you will agree that if you tell Indians, would you like to know about Japanese politics or would you like to know about Trump? 99% of Indians are not interested in Japanese politics. They're only interested in American politics or American culture and not Japanese culture and so on. So my point was that we have to write in a way where we draw the average Indian Joe and Jane into the net, because we don't have to convince the strategic and academic community in India. They are already extremely well versed in the subject. The question is how to convert what they know, the knowledge that we have in our strategic and academic community, into mass knowledge. And so I think that is the point I wanted to make, and that I think is important.
Yeah.
Thanks, Vijay.
Okay. Next question, please.
So we have Ambassador Kishan Rana who has posed a question.
Sure. Ambassador Rana, sir, would you like to take the floor, please? Ambassador Rana?
Yes, sir. I'll read out the question I posed in the chat window. Might one suggest another perspective, Mr. Gokhale? Deng was no less committed to the permanence of CCP rule as Xi Jinping, even if their methods have differed. But why is it that in speaking of China, and the flood of writing on the 100th anniversary, most of us tend to say nothing of the deaths of around 60 or 70 million.
Sorry, I think we have lost you.
Yeah.
Ambassador Rana, I think Mr. Venkatraman, why don't you just read out what's there in the chat?
Sorry?
We lost you, sir.
Okay. To read out what I had in the.
I think
chat.
Venkat will read out what you had put in the chat box.
Thank you, sir.
Ambassador Rana's question was, might one suggest another perspective, Mr. Gokhale? Deng was no less committed to the permanence of CCP rule as Xi Jinping, even if their methods have differed. But why is it that in speaking of China, most of us tend to say nothing of the death of around 60 to 70 million in the massive efforts of the land reforms of the early 1950s, the Great Leap-induced famine of 1959-61, and the killings of the Cultural Revolution? Almost no one wants to mention this now. Why?
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for that question. I am in complete agreement with you on this. I think that this is perhaps where I find knowledge about China lacking among the larger population of India. And if I may offer a reason, sir, although this may not be entirely valid, but I believe that the happenings of 1962 essentially diverted the attention of India to the boundary issue, to the conflict with China. And ever since then, we have been great consumers of information relating to the boundary, the line of actual control, or where the lines were, how many lines there were, and so on, to the detriment of larger issues relating to China itself, including how the revolution happened and subsequently the grave mistakes, just the Great Leap Forward, as you said, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, and so on. So I entirely agree with you that these are facts we need to bring out, not least because I think the younger Indians are to some extent impressed by China's progress, as perhaps they should be, but are entirely ignorant of the fact that a huge price has been paid for this.
Yeah.
So my own view says that we need to do more writings for the average Indian.
Yeah. Okay. May I just add, Vijay, to what you said, that even in understanding 1962, what was happening before 1962 is very important, because there is a connection of why 1962 happened, why Mao decided to do what he did, with what he was going through, being pushed to the second line of the leadership because of the failure of the Great Leap Forward, because of the communization program. There is a link between that domestic politics and even 62. So even if we want to have a better analysis of why 1962 happened, I think the very cataclysmic events of the Great Leap Forward, the kind of Great Famine that China went through as a result, these are important inputs into our understanding of 1962.
Right.
Yeah, can we have the next question, please?
So we have Ms. Nainima Basu from the print who would like to ask the question.
Okay. Nainima, are you there?
Hello, yes, sir. Good afternoon, and thank you for giving me this chance. Just to understand from Sir Ambassador Gokhale and also from you, Ambassador Sagan, that although I'm not an expert in this at all, and there are people discussing the books, which is a fantastic book. Sir knows that I have read it. But if I can ask, how is it that you are viewing the kind of speech that we heard from President Xi this time, where a lot of debate is going on the fact that, he talked about bloodshed and other things. And also, since this is, happening right now in Afghanistan, a lot of talks are going on that China can play a dominant role there. Should India be concerned? What are your thoughts? I'll be grateful if you can share. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nayanima. I think President Xi Jinping's speech, or more correctly, General Secretary Xi Jinping's speech on the occasion of the 100th anniversary is a speech which I think is being dissected all over the world, including, I presume, by scholars in India as well. So I think you will hear a multiplicity of opinions on this. My own sense is that, at least for me, this was essentially an address to a domestic audience on a very important anniversary where the party's achievements were being put on display. And at the same time, there was an effort to convince a younger generation of Chinese who had not witnessed the revolution or the subsequent difficult periods that China had passed through, that the prosperity they enjoy today, the wealth that is being generated, the comfort that they enjoy is because of this party and not because of some vague concept of the Chinese nation. It is the Communist Party which has delivered this and will continue to do so. I know that a lot of attention is being focused on the famous phrase that you will get a bloody head if you bang your head against the wall of 1.4 billion people. And I'm sure there was some messaging to the external world, but my sense is that this was internal messaging primarily. But I think we could request Ambassador Shamsaran to share his views on this, and even Ambassador Kantha, because I'm sure that they have read this speech equally carefully.
Well, I mean, instead of taking up the time of our colleagues here, just to say that I have, in fact, written an article about this, I think for the Indian Express, perhaps, which spells out, for whatever it is worth, my analysis of the speech. So perhaps you can have a look at that. Any further question?
So we have General J.S. Bajwa who has raised this.
General Bajwa?
Question.
Yeah. General Bajwa, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Pranam to everybody, and thank you very much, Vijay and Ambassador Sharan. It's lovely hearing you speak on this. I met him at Beijing when I'd gone on my study leave when Vijay was there in 2000. My question, Vijay, is, with Xi Jinping insisting on the PLA's loyalty to the party first before the nation, is this going to impact the professionalism of the PLA? Is it going to be a situation like India had in 1962? What is your opinion, please? Thank you.
Thank you, General Bajwa. And it's a delight to see you again. My own view in this matter is that right from the foundation of the People's Liberation Army, the emphasis of the party has always been that the gun is under the control of the party. The 1927 Putian resolution, which is the first resolution that was passed forming the Red Army, at that time it was not called the People's Liberation Army, essentially emphasized this point. And this was always Mao's view that if power springs from the barrel of the gun, then it is better that it is controlled by the party. So to that extent, I don't think President Xi Jinping is deviating from the views of the founders of the People's Republic of China. And I think he would also recall that in 1989, there were concerns, although I think the West exaggerated them, of disquiet in the PLA at being used in this manner. The fact is that certain purges did take place after the Tiananmen incident under Deng's leadership, because Deng continued to remain the chairman of the Central Military Commission. And that is another indication of where the power really vests. The party survives only because it has armed force. So I think to that extent, Xi Jinping is not different. But what I think is interesting is the extent to which Xi Jinping has centralized national security. So first of all, he has taken on the role of commander-in-chief of the PLA, which neither Mao nor Deng took. Of course, one could explain this by the fact that Mao and Deng actually commanded armies and participated in fighting, whereas Xi Jinping has not done so. So perhaps this was a lacuna. But the way in which he has brought the People's Armed Police, which was under the control of the State Council, into the Central Military Commission, the way he has brought the People's Militia and the Maritime Militia, as well as the Public Security Bureau, means that one man controls all the levers of power: the police, the paramilitary forces, and the military. And I think this is perhaps a new phenomenon, which suggests to me that there is a concern. At least to me, when you tighten the grip, you only tighten the grip when you fear it is loosening. You don't otherwise tighten the grip. I mean, we all tighten our grip on the wallet because we are frightened of losing it, not because we love the wallet. So I think that we need to do a lot more study. Frankly, I haven't done any study on this, but I think that we need to look at whether all these signs, whether it is Xi Jinping's speech, whether the PLA comes before the nation and so on, are signs of bravado, confidence, or are they signs actually of internal anxiety which are being expressed? My sense is it is the latter, but there will be more opinions on this.
Thank you very much.
So we have two more questions. One is from Mr. Shantanu Roy Chaudhary. His question is, watching China from outside today, what are some indicators that one can pick up to gauge the nuances and the inner working of the Chinese Communist Party?
Okay.
The second question is from Mr. Mohit Verma on the YouTube channel. Can what happened in Hong Kong be called as the second Tiananmen incident? Are there any similarities between the two?
Yeah. Okay, Vijay. Well, of course, it would be the third Tiananmen incident, not the second.
Yes. Answering Mr. Mohit Verma's question, I don't think we can strictly compare the Tiananmen incident with what is happening in Hong Kong. My sense is that what is happening in Hong Kong and why the Chinese state is worried about it is because this generation of Hong Kongers, unlike an earlier generation, realize that in their lifetimes, Hong Kong is going to become a part of China. Those who had reached adulthood in 1989 when the Basic Law was signed, they were confident that in 50 years they'd be gone. So there was really no anxiety about their status, their lifestyle, their status, and so on. This group, however, realizes that even if China were to continue to honor the basic agreement, the basic law, they would be still in their 50s by the time it would become truly a part of the People's Republic of China in every sense. So I think the protests that are taking place reflect that anxiety, both from the Hong Kong perspective and the way the Chinese have reacted from the Chinese perspective. They see this as a genuine movement to redefine Hong Kong in a manner which is not in line with Chinese policy, official Chinese policy. But I don't think this is a Tiananmen incident in the way that 1976 or 1989 was. If you could repeat the first question because I missed it, Mr. Roy Chaudhary's question.
Yeah. So he has asked, watching China from outside today, what are some indicators that one can pick up to gauge the nuances and the inner working of the Chinese Communist Party?
So that's an interesting question because at the moment it all seems like one completely opaque cube, and whichever way you look at the cube, you can't look into the cube. But I think we have to look for clues which are not obvious. The way in which they deal with the PLA is one, but what interests me more is the way they are dealing with big business. If you look at the developments that have taken place with Jack Ma and Ant Financial, with Didi Chuxing, the taxi hailing cab company, with Tencent and WeChat, and with a number of others, one wonders whether this is simply the 21st century version of what Teddy Roosevelt did in America, which is the antitrust law. And I do understand that China needs to do this because big business can become very big business and opaque business. So what America did with Standard Oil and US Steel the Chinese may now be doing with Alibaba and Tencent. But the United States did it essentially to ensure fair competition and perhaps to protect the consumer. I doubt there was an underlying political concern. In this case, however, there is a niggling doubt, and I have no evidence, and therefore it is important to work on this, that this is not simply a concern about monopoly or a concern about the consumer losing out to big business. It is also about big business having the capacity to influence politics. So I think that is one area where if we do research, we might get a clue about thinking. In addition to, of course, the way they are doing things with the PLA. The third, of course, is on the issue of Taiwan. Increasingly, this is coming into discussion much more than earlier. The Chinese are becoming much more open about, in other words, I think strategic ambiguity, which was both US and Chinese policy, appear to be narrowing. In both cases, they appear to be narrowing. Now, one can understand the US trying to narrow down strategic ambiguity simply because it doesn't have the force capability to remain strategically ambiguous anymore. The Chinese actually within the first island chain can pretty much influence events if they wish. But we need to ask why the Chinese are narrowing strategic ambiguity. And is it that there is an anxiety internally that the leader is not able to maintain the unity of China? Is it that there is pressure on the leader to complete the unfinished agenda of Chinese partition, for example, in his time? My sense, the short point I'm making is that it is through these happenings that we might gauge what is happening inside the party, because at this stage, barring a few odd accounts of outliers like Cai Xia or Ren Jianqing and so on, we really don't know what's happening inside the party because there's a pretty serious clampdown and a firewall that Xi Jinping has erected, which literally removes all kinds of chatter on social media within seconds. So we have to look to these things to make out whether there is a certain churning in China.
Okay. Venkat, do we? How long can we continue? I think we have
roughly around 8 minutes. Sir. We have
about 8 minutes.
Professor Anantakumar Giri. Sorry.
Yes, that's fine. Yes.
Yeah. We have Professor Anantakumar Giri who would like to ask a question, and Ambassador Vishnu Prakash has requested if a short question is possible.
Okay, so let's take these two questions one by one.
Professor Anantakumar Giri.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Gokhale. Now, reflecting on Tiananmen Square now, building on your reference to anxiety and many unknown streams that we do not know. Still, my question is, what is the process of struggle for social freedom? And what is the legacy of martyrs and human rights fighters like Liu Xiaobo in contemporary China? And how do we really understand this, the struggle for social freedom? And to make sense of that, we also are called upon to engage with China, not only just geopolitically, but also theoretically and philosophically. And that way, and in a way, the parallel between contemporary India and contemporary China. Because in India also, within a democratic veneer, we are living under tremendous pressure of killing of life. Anybody can be arrested. So I request you to kindly reflect upon the condition of tyranny in contemporary India and China and the prospect for real freedom via constitutional means as well.
Professor Giri, we have to define what social freedom means. Because I think there is perhaps the understanding in India is still that there is a very heavy hand to all kinds of freedoms in China. Now, if one were to live in China, and many of those who are listening in today have lived in China at various times, we would realize that there is a fair degree of social and cultural freedom, whether it is in terms of gender, whether it is in terms of social mobility. rising up the ranks in terms of social mobility, whether it is in terms of arts, music, and so on. There is a fair amount of choice available. I think that it is the politics that is essentially controlled. And of course, where the politics seeps into those elements of culture or society, there is a sort of slight, there is a friction. For instance, the one child, two child policy might have led to some amount of anxiety. China's behavior with its ethnic minorities, for instance, or lack of information, access to the Western information because of firewalls. But I think we need to also be clear that those who might be dissatisfied with this may not be the majority, because the majority might still feel that there is a balance between what material comforts they now have as compared to what they had in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And the fact that this is not a North Korean or Stalinist totalitarian state, but one which allows you to have a fair amount of personal freedom, social freedom, economic freedom, and cultural freedom as well. So I think we need to understand this. Now, this is, I don't mean to say by this that every Chinese is extremely happy with the situation, but I do think that the West in particular assumed that as the Chinese got richer and the Chinese became more well off, that Western democratic ideas or what they call universal human rights and human values would come into the Chinese people. My own sense is that this showed a lack of Chinese understanding of Chinese history. It has nothing to do with the Communist Party. And here I stick my neck out by saying that it is similar. I think Indians also have this view that if the Communist Party were to disappear overnight, for instance, we would have no boundary problem with China. Here again, I think we are deluding ourselves because we don't read history. The fact is that China laid claim to our boundary even in the pre-communist period. And if magically the Communist Party were to disappear tomorrow, the boundary problem would not disappear. Therefore, the short point is we need much more study to get a nuanced understanding of China rather than a very black and white one, which is what the average Indian has about China today.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Last question, please.
So we have Ambassador Vishnu Prakash who wanted to ask another question.
Okay, so that will be the last question.
Yes,
Vishnu?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Vijay, it is not related to your book. Can I ask it if there's a window, or I will not? Okay, this question then is addressed both to you and Ambassador Shyam Saran. The China-Russia relations are both tactical and strategic. Now, is it getting progressively more strategic, and is it here to stay?
I will just answer this very briefly, Vishnu, by saying that while there is no doubt that they are coming together, they're coming closer, my sense is that it is not a face-to-face friendship. It is protecting each other's backs. And I think we need to look at possible fault lines. Those fault lines include immigration in the Russian Far East, Chinese sort of blackmail to get energy at cheaper prices, Russia's concerns about China trying to dilute their role as an Arctic power, and so on and so forth. So there are fault lines. I think overall the Russians also feel that they are being pushed into the role of junior partner. But I think at this stage, the rest of the world is not cutting Russia any slack. And by rest of the world, I mean Europe and the United States. But I also mean that the India-Russia relationship appears to have gone into a bit of a hibernation, which we need to revive, because for us, this is the one country with which we have no fundamental conflict of interest. But we should not take that alone for granted. We need to invest. So my sense is that because nobody else is investing in the relationship with Russia, the Russians are moving closer to China for their own security and for their own economic well-being.
Just to maybe add to that, what Vijay has said, in terms of the fault lines, if you see what is of, or maybe what Russia will say its core interests, that those core interests are very much with respect to what it calls its near neighborhood, which is essentially, Eastern Europe. It is Central Asia. Now, which is the power which is expanding most in these two regions, and at the cost of Russian presence or interest there? It is China. So I would imagine that this does cause some disquiet in Russia. The other point which has come out in some of the interactions we have had with the Russians, I don't know about the official interactions, but what may be referred to as track 2 interactions with some of the Russians who are dealing with strategic or nuclear issues, there is growing concern about the Chinese nuclear deterrent. And several times I have heard our Soviet friends say that, we can't just have a bilateral sort of a process with the United States of America with regard to arms control, because, next door China is, in fact, expanding its nuclear arsenal. It is improving its, nuclear weapons, its anti-missile systems, and therefore, while at this point of time, perhaps we can agree that maybe China can still remain outside. But on that particular point, actually, the American view and the Russian view is quite similar. That the time has come for China to also join the strategic arms limitation, negotiations. And also, if you see the efforts by Russia with regard to, for example, SCO or the Eurasian Economic Union, they have actually played quite a encouraging role for India's participation as well as greater activity. SCO, it is certainly true that the Chinese were not very enthusiastic about India becoming a full member, and there Russia did push our case very strongly, and I think that was related again to making certain that SCO does not become a totally Chinese dominated institution. So bottom line is that there is not necessarily a long-term congruence in Russian and Chinese interests. But as Vijay pointed out, if the kind of pressures from Europe and the United States continue to mount, then you should not be surprised that even if the Russians have these reservations get somewhat muted. But in our own relations with Russia, I think it is very important that we should keep the relationship in good repair, precisely because of our awareness that these kind of discontinuities or discongruence, in a sense, exist between China and Russia. Thank you. So with that, again, thank you very much, Vijay, for taking time to not only introduce your book, give us a sense of what are some of its key points, and very patiently, answering all the questions that have been raised. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank the Institute for Chinese Studies for organizing this very interesting conversation, very stimulating conversation, I would say. And with that, let me conclude this session. Thank you very much for your attention. All the participants, very distinguished people, have been attending this, so that is a tribute, Vijay, to your drawing.
Thank you, sir.
So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.